The air at Naval Station Rota was a thick, wet blanket woven from salt, diesel, and the sweet, cloying scent of oleander blossoms fighting a losing war against the grit of the Andalusian coast. It was a place of transience, a waypoint of steel and concrete where the relentless sun beat down on the gray hulls of destroyers and the tired asphalt of the flight line with equal democratic indifference. But on this particular stretch of sand, designated for the brief, precious leisure of its inhabitants, the world was supposed to be simpler. Here, the thrum of the bass was meant to recede, replaced by the rhythmic shush of the Mediterranean tide and the shrieks of children chasing foam. It was a forced paradise, a mandatory exhalation between deployments, and the tension of the world beyond never truly left. It merely shimmered, a heat haze on the horizon just past the container ships in the distant hazy shadow of Africa. She sat apart from the boisterous family groups and the clusters of young sailors whose laughter was as loud and brittle as their boasts. Her towel was a faded blue rectangle on the pale sand, an island of deliberate solitude. To any casual observer, she was a creature of utter nondescription, a footnote in the scenery. Her one-piece swimsuit was a functional, dark navy, devoid of the fashionable cuts and vibrant colors that dotted the beach. Her hair, a plain brown, was pulled back in a severe, practical knot. A pair of standard-issue glasses rested on her nose, and behind them her eyes scanned the pages of a thick paperback textbook on advanced trauma care, its cover warped by humidity. She did not sunbathe, she occupied space. She did not relax. She existed in a state of controlled stillness, a coiled spring at rest. Her name was Isabella Rossi, and in the rigid, rank-conscious ecosystem of the military, her official designation was Lieutenant Navy Nurse Corps. But here, on the sand, she was just a woman, small and unassuming, easily dismissed, which was precisely how the world, in her experience, preferred its true masters to appear. He, on the other hand, was impossible to dismiss. He strode along the high tide line as if he were personally responsible for holding back the sea. Major Charles Davis of the United States Marine Corps was an aide-de-camp, a role that he interpreted as being the sun around which a general's planet-sized ego revolved. His uniform, even here, was a declaration of intent. Perfectly creased desert camouflage trousers, bloused over gleaming boots that had no business touching sand, and a tight olive-drab t-shirt that showed off the disciplined musculature of a man who spent more time in the gym than in the field. Mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but not the perpetual sneer that seemed etched into his jawline. An earpiece was nestled in his right ear, a constant link to a world of schedules and motorcades that he believed was the only world that mattered. He moved with a manufactured urgency, his posture a rigid caricature of military bearing. Authority for Major Davis was not an intrinsic quality. It was a costume to be worn, a volume to be projected. He was the gatekeeper, the sword and shield for the four-star Titan he served, and his face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, hard, angular, and utterly convinced of its own importance. The object of his protective orbit, General Marcus Thorne, was holding court under a large canopy, surrounded by his family. The general himself was a quiet man, his presence a gravity well of earned respect. But Davis compensated for his boss's calm with a frantic, buzzing energy. He was a sheepdog nipping at the heels of phantoms, correcting the placement of a cooler, speaking sharply into his wrist microphone about the status of the general's transportation, and generally radiating an aura of high-level stress that was profoundly out of place amidst the gentle surf and laughing children. He saw the world as a series of threats to be managed and subordinates to be directed. The beach was not a place of rest. It was a tactical environment, and the civilians and lower enlisted personnel dotting the sand were obstacles, potential security breaches, or simply irrelevant scenery. His gaze swept over the woman reading the book. He registered her as nothing, a pale, uninteresting shape, less than a ghost. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a thunderclap but a subtle shift in the beach's auditory fabric. The tapestry of joyful noise, the splashing, the shouting, the laughter, was pierced by a single high-pitched scream. It was a sound of pure, undiluted terror. the kind that cuts through all other frequencies and speaks directly to the primitive core of the brain. A mother's scream. All heads turned, conversations died. The world snapped into a horrifying new focus. A small form was being pulled from the water, limp and unnervingly still. A boy, no older than 8, his skin a terrifying shade of blue-gray, his bright red swim trunks a slash of bouillane and color against the pale, wet sand. Chaos erupted, a bloom of panic and useless, flapping gestures. People rushed forward, forming a thick, morbid circle. Others stood frozen, hands covering their mouths. The boy's mother was hysterical, her cries tearing at the placid afternoon air. Major Davis reacted as he was trained to react to any crisis. He sought to establish control. He barged through the ring of onlookers, his voice a drill sergeant's bark. "Back up! Give him space! Everybody back up! Right now, I need a medic! Does anyone see a corpsman?" He was loud, he was commanding, and he was utterly, catastrophically useless. He was managing the crowd, not the casualty. His mind was on protocols, perimeters, and the chain of command, while the boy's brain was being starved of oxygen with every passing second. But someone else was already moving. Before the circle had even fully formed, the quiet woman in the Navy swimsuit had closed her textbook, placing it deliberately on her towel. She did not run. She moved with a frightening economy of motion, a fluid and purposeful stride that devoured the sand between her and the dying child. There was no panic in her actions, only a chilling, absolute focus. She slid through a gap in the crowd, her small frame slipping past the larger frozen bodies of onlookers as if they were nothing more than mist. She reached the boy and dropped to her knees in the wet sand, her movements precise, practiced, and immediate. The world narrowed to the space occupied by that small, still body. Major Davis, turning from his task of shouting at the concerned but ineffective crowd, saw her. He saw a civilian, a woman, kneeling where she had no right to be, contaminating what he had unilaterally declared a controlled scene. His mind, conditioned by prejudice and a rigid adherence to perceived hierarchy, processed her presence as an intolerable breach of protocol. He strode toward her, his shadow falling over her and the child. "Ma'am," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, the word ma'am a thinly veiled insult. "You need to step aside. This is a secure area. Medical personnel are on the way." She did not look up. She did not acknowledge his existence. Her fingers were already on the boy's carotid artery, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Her other hand tilted his head back, clearing the airway. Her eyes scanned his chest, looking for the rise and fall that was absent. To Major Davis, this was insubordination. To Isabella Rossi, he was just noise, a distracting sound on the periphery of the only thing that mattered in the universe at that moment. She issued a single, clear command, not to him, but to the space around her. "Clear!" It was not a request, it was a statement of fact, an auditory scalpel cutting away the unnecessary. His frustration flared into anger. The sheer audacity of this woman, this nobody, to ignore a field-grade officer in the midst of a crisis was unthinkable. It was a personal affront to the edifice of authority he had so carefully constructed around himself. "Did you hear me?" he snarled, leaning closer, his voice low and menacing. "I am in charge here. Get back before you do more harm." He reached down and placed a heavy, commanding hand on her shoulder, intending to physically lift her and move her away from the scene. It was like trying to move a block of granite. She did not flinch. She did not turn. The muscles in her shoulder and back simply absorbed the pressure without yielding. In one smooth, continuous motion, she shrugged his hand off as one might dislodge a bothersome insect, never breaking the rhythm of her assessment. Her focus remained absolute, a beam of pure, concentrated will directed at the child. Then she spoke, her voice still calm, clinical, and utterly devoid of emotion. "He's in VFib. I need an AED now." She did not look at him. She directed the words over her shoulder to anyone in the crowd who was capable of understanding and acting. And then she began compressions. Her hands locked together, her arms a rigid piston. She began the brutal, life-giving rhythm of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The sound was stark and ugly, the dull thud of force on the small sternum, punctuated by her own controlled exhalations. She was no longer an unassuming woman reading a book. She had transformed. She had become an instrument of pure, unadulterated competence. The beach, the crowd, the arrogant major, all of it had ceased to exist. There was only the mission, to force life back into the lifeless. Major Davis stood there, his hands still tingling from the rebuff, momentarily stunned into silence. He was a man whose entire career was built on the immediate and unquestioning obedience of others. Her complete and total dismissal of his authority was something his brain could not properly compute. He saw her begin the compressions, and a part of him, the small, insecure part that fueled his bluster, was convinced she was a well-meaning but ignorant civilian who was going to kill the boy faster. He opened his mouth to shout again, to physically drag her away this time, but the sheer undeniable authority of her actions held him in place. It was in the perfect posture of her back, the metronomic precision of the compressions, the focused intensity that radiated from her like heat from a furnace. He was witnessing a masterclass, and the dawning, terrifying realization that he was completely out of his depth began to trickle into his consciousness like ice water. Her voice cut through the air again, sharp and clear, a weapon against the chaos. "You!" She pointed without looking, her eyes still locked on the child. She indicated a young sailor who was standing frozen at the edge of the circle. "Run to the lifeguard tower, get their automated external defibrillator in their airway bag. Tell them you have a pediatric drowning, non-responsive, and apneic. Use those exact words. Go." The sailor, jolted out of his stupor by the sheer force of her command, blinked and then took off, sprinting down the beach with a desperation he normally reserved for combat drills. She then pointed to another person, a woman clutching a phone. Have you called emergency services?" The woman nodded dumbly. "What did you tell them?" The woman stammered, I said a boy drowned." Rossi's next words were a clinical correction, a lesson in crisis communication. "Call them back. Tell them to dispatch advanced life support. Specify pediatric cardiac arrest secondary to drowning at the main family beach. Give them the access point. Be precise. It matters." She did not ask for command. She did not announce her authority. She simply was command. Her expertise was so total, so self-evident, that it created its own hierarchy. Rank, uniform, and title became meaningless concepts in the face of her overwhelming competence. The crowd, including the shell-shocked Major Davis, became her unwilling but obedient subordinates. They were no longer a panicked mob. They were a hastily deputized support team, and she was their unquestioned director. She was a lioness allowing jackals to dance at the edge of its kill radius, so long as they did not interfere with the work. Davis watched, his mouth agape, as this small, plain woman orchestrated the scene with the detached precision of a battlefield surgeon. The language she used was a foreign dialect of expertise, a litany of acronyms and clinical terms that silenced all the amateurs. The young sailor returned, gasping for breath, the bright orange case of the AED in his hands. "Here," he panted. Rossi did not miss a single compression. "Open it. Attach the pads." "You know how?" The sailor shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "The diagram is on the pads," she stated, her voice a calm instruction in a sea of panic. "One on the upper right chest, one on the lower left side. Do it now." The sailor's hands trembled as he ripped open the boy's swim trunks and fumbled with the sticky pads. Rossi continued compressions, her body a machine, her face a mask of concentration. "Pads are on," the sailor said, his voice cracking. The machine's electronic voice began its tinny, synthesized analysis. "Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient." For the first time, Rossi stopped. She hovered over the boy, her hands raised, her body coiled. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the sound of the waves and the whirring of the small machine. It felt like an eternity. Major Davis found he was holding his breath. He was witnessing something sacred and terrible, a battle being fought on a microscopic, electrical level for the soul of a child. The machine's verdict came. "Shock advised. Charging. Stand clear." Rossi's voice was a sharp crack in the silence. "Everybody clear?" The crowd, which had crept forward, instinctively shuffled back. "I'm clear, you're clear, we're all clear," she recited, the litany of final critical safety check. She pressed the blinking orange button. The boy's small body arched violently off the sand, a grotesque, convulsive leap, before falling back, limp. It was a horrifying sight, but Rossi was already moving, her hands immediately resuming their rhythmic compressions, forcing the oxygenated blood through the shocked heart, trying to coax it back into a stable rhythm. She did not wait to see if it had worked. She trusted the process. She trusted her training. For 2 more minutes, the only sounds were her counted breaths and the thud of her hands on his chest. It was a grueling, physically demanding ordeal, but she showed no signs of fatigue. She was a testament to the power of discipline over duress. And then, a miracle. A small, choked cough, a sputtering gasp, water mixed with vomit spewed from the boy's mouth. Rossi instantly rolled him onto his side into the recovery position, her movements swift and sure, clearing his airway with practiced efficiency. Another gasp, this one stronger, followed by a thin, reedy wail. The sound, the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard, broke the spell. The crowd erupted in a collective sob of relief. The boy's mother collapsed to her knees, weeping with gratitude. Major Davis just stood there, his carefully constructed world shattered into a million pieces. He had just witnessed a force of nature in a navy blue swimsuit, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. It was at that moment that the final pieces of the drama arrived on stage. A man pushed his way through the now parting crowd, his face a pale mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet, immense presence of a man long accustomed to command. The 4 silver stars on the collar of his polo shirt glinted in the harsh sunlight. It was General Marcus Thorne, the boy's father. He saw his son, alive and crying, and his gaze shot to the woman tending to him. Then he saw his aide, Major Davis, standing nearby looking utterly poleaxed. "What happened?" the general demanded, his voice a low rumble of fear and authority. Davis snapped to attention, his training taking over, but his voice was unsteady. "Sir, your son, he was unresponsive in the water. This civilian administered aid." He gestured vaguely toward Rossi, the word civilian still clinging to his tongue out of habit, but now it sounded weak, foolish. The general's eyes, sharp and analytical even in his distress, took in the entire scene in a fraction of a second. The AED, the controlled manner of the woman, the cowed look on his aide's face. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading people and situations, from battlefields to boardrooms. He knew competence when he saw it. He recognized the unmistakable calm of a true professional operating at the peak of their abilities. "Major," General Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "stand down and shut up." The words were a quiet execution, a public dismantling of his aide's authority. The general knelt beside Rossi, his eyes fixed on his son. "Is he started, his voice thick with emotion. Rossi did not look at him. Her attention was still entirely on her patient. "He has a pulse. He's breathing. He needs immediate transport for observation. He's taken on a lot of water." Her tone was still clinical, professional. She was a nurse treating a patient, not a lieutenant addressing a 4-star general. The sirens in the distance grew louder, a welcome confirmation that her orders had been followed. An ambulance, lights flashing, skidded to a halt on the access road behind the dunes. A team of medics rushed down to the beach, followed by a Navy captain in a starched khaki uniform. The captain was the base commanding officer, a man whose day had just gone from placid to apocalyptic. He saw the general, he saw the general's son, and then he saw the woman in the swimsuit calmly giving a verbal handoff to the arriving paramedics, a string of technical medical data that was clear, concise, and perfect. The captain's eyes widened in disbelief. He stopped dead in his tracks. "Lieutenant Rossi," the captain breathed, his voice a mixture of shock and reverence. "My God, it's you." General Thorne, who was helping the medics lift his son onto a gurney, turned his head at the captain's words. He looked from the captain's stunned face back to the unassuming woman, now standing and wiping sand from her knees. "You know this officer, Captain?" he asked, his voice laced with a new kind of curiosity. The base commander swallowed, his eyes still locked on Rossi. He felt the weight of every eye on the beach turning to him, waiting for the explanation that would make sense of the last 10 minutes. He looked at General Thorne, a man he deeply respected, and then back at the quiet lieutenant who seemed completely oblivious to the gravity of the moment she had just created. "Sir," the captain began, his voice taking on the tone of a man recounting a piece of sacred lore. I, I was the executive officer at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center 2 years ago. We received the casualties from the bombing at the Ramstein Airfield Transit Hub. He paused, gathering himself. The reports we got, they were chaos. But there was one constant, one name. The first responder on the scene was a Navy nurse who was there by chance, waiting for a flight. She took control. She ran triage for nearly an hour, completely alone. She performed 2 emergency cricothyrotomies with a pocket knife and the ink tube from a pen. She single-handedly stabilized 17 critical casualties before the medevac helicopters even spooled up. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering from the woman who now stood quietly, wrapping her towel around her shoulders. The survivors, the medics who arrived, they all called her the same thing. They called her the Angel of Ramstein. He finally looked directly at the general. "Sir, that is Lieutenant Isabella Rossi. The citation for her Navy Cross is still likely classified at a level I don't have clearance to read." A profound, bottomless silence descended upon the beach. It was heavier than the humid air, more powerful than the sound of the sea. The name, the legend, landed like a physical weight, pressing down on every single person present. Major Charles Davis felt it most of all. The world tilted on its axis. The unassuming woman he had tried to bully, the civilian he had attempted to physically remove, was not just an officer. She was a decorated war hero, a living legend whose competence was so profound it had become myth. He felt the blood drain from his face. He was not just wrong, he had been spectacularly, historically, and publicly wrong. He had stood on the shore and tried to command a tidal wave to retreat. The humiliation was so total, so complete, that it felt like a physical blow. He wanted the sand to open up and swallow him whole. Later, in the sterile, quiet confines of the base clinic, the world had been put back in order. But it was a new order. General Thorne's son was stable, sleeping peacefully in a pediatric bed, his mother holding his hand. The general stood in the hallway, his posture no longer that of a commander, but of a profoundly grateful father. He had found Lieutenant Rossi finishing her report with the on-duty doctor. She was dressed now in a simple khaki uniform, her rank insignia barely visible on her collar. She looked just as unassuming as she had on the beach. "Lieutenant," General Thorne began, his voice quiet and heavy with sincerity. "There are no words. The words thank you feel inadequate. You saved my son's life." Rossi simply nodded, her expression neutral. "I did what was necessary, sir. He's a strong kid. He'll be fine." Her lack of ceremony was more powerful than any grand statement would have been. She had not acted for glory, or for thanks, or for the approval of a 4-star general. She had acted because it was her function, as natural to her as breathing. Major Davis stood a few paces behind the general, his posture ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. He had been ordered to come to bear witness to this final, quiet scene. General Thorne turned to him, his expression hardening. "Major," Davis's head snapped up. "Sir, I believe you have something to say to the lieutenant." Davis took a stiff step forward. He looked at Rossi, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a small woman, but a giant. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice hoarse, I apologize. My actions were unprofessional and inexcusable. I failed to properly assess the situation." "There is no excuse, ma'am." Isabella Rossi regarded him not with anger or triumph or even pity. She looked at him with the cool, analytical gaze of a diagnostician examining a symptom. She turned to General Thorne. "Sir," she said, her voice even and clinical, "with all due respect, your aide's apology is secondary to the issue. What he displayed on that beach was not merely a personal failing. It was a tactical one, a critical training scar." The general raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Explain," he commanded. "He mistakes authority for competence," she stated plainly. "He sees a uniform and a rank, and he makes an assessment. He sees a lack of one, and he makes a different assessment. He's conditioned to respond to the symbols of power, not the substance of it. On a battlefield, that way of thinking gets people killed. He didn't see a medical emergency being managed. He saw a civilian disrupting his perimeter. His first instinct was not to support the life-saving intervention, but to control the optics. That is a dangerous deficit in an officer, especially one on a general's staff. General Thorne listened, his expression grim. She had dissected the issue with the same precision she had used to restart his son's heart. She had gone past the personal insult and straight to the systemic failure. I intend to relieve him of his duties, Lieutenant. There will be a full review in his record. Rossi held up a hand, a small, subtle gesture of dissent that was somehow more commanding than a shout. Punishment won't fix the underlying problem, sir. He doesn't need a reprimand. He needs an education. The general looked at her, waiting. Don't send him away, she continued. Send him down. Assign him to the enlisted barracks for 90 days. Temporary duty to the Naval Hospital. Have him work with the corpsmen and the nurses. Have him clean bedpans, stock supply closets, transport patients. Have him watch a 19-year-old corpsman claim a dying Marine. Have him see a nurse hold the hand of a soldier's wife while a doctor delivers the worst news of her life. He needs to learn, from the ground up, what service actually looks like. He needs to understand that the real work is not always done by the people with the most stripes on their sleeves or stars on their collars. Let him learn respect not through fear of punishment, but through proximity to true strength. General Thorne stared at her for a long moment. He saw in her a wisdom that went far beyond her years and her rank. She was not interested in revenge or retribution. She was interested in fixing a problem, in making the institution better. It was the mark of a true leader. Consider it done, Lieutenant, he said, his voice filled with a new profound respect. Your recommendation is now a direct order. The story of that day on the beach at Rota passed into the quiet lore of the services. It became a modern military fable, a story told in ready rooms and chow halls, a teaching tool at officer candidate schools. The details grew with each telling: the size of the waves, the number of people she saved, the ferocity of the general's dressing down of his aide. But the core truth of it, the essential lesson, remained pure. It was a story about the vast difference between appearance and reality, between assumed authority and earned competence. Years passed. Major Davis became Lieutenant Colonel Davis, and eventually Colonel Davis. He was never again an aide-de-camp. His career took a different path. He became an instructor, a mentor, a man known for his quiet humility and his almost fanatical devotion to teaching young officers the realities of leadership. He was considered one of the finest instructors at the Command and Staff College, a man whose lessons were forged in the crucible of his own profound humiliation. He often told his story, not with shame, but as a point of instruction. He would stand before a lecture hall of bright, ambitious young captains and majors, the future leaders of the Corps, and he would tell them about a hot day on a Spanish beach. I was the picture of authority, he would say, his voice resonating with hard-won wisdom. I had the uniform, the rank, the proximity to power, and I was the single most useless person on that beach. The most powerful person there was a small, quiet Navy lieutenant in a swimsuit with no insignia, no title, and no fanfare. But she had something none of my authority could grant her: absolute, unquestionable competence. He would let that sink in. Your greatest strength as a leader, he would conclude, his eyes sweeping the room, will not be the orders you give. It will be the actions you take when the chaos descends. Your rank gives you the privilege of command, but only your competence gives you the right to lead. Never, ever forget that. The most dangerous person in the room is often the quietest. Look for the substance, not the symbols. Look for the doers, not the talkers. Look for the Lieutenant Rosses of the world. And when you find them, for God's sake, get out of their way and let them work. The story in the end was not about the humbling of a single arrogant major. It was a testament to a larger, more enduring truth. That true strength is not loud, but quiet. That true authority is not claimed, but demonstrated. It is a quiet professionalism that exists in the sinew of any great organization. the steel spine that holds everything up when the pressure is greatest. It is found in the unassuming nurse, the quiet technician, the diligent specialist, the hidden masters who wear no crowns, but who, in the moment of ultimate crisis, become the only reality that matters. Their actions are their argument, their competence, their creed, and their legacy is not written in commendations or carved on statues, but in the lives they save and the lessons they teach, long after the noise of the insecure has faded into a forgotten silence.